The sound of labored breathing cuts through the silence. Not the breathing of exertion, but the desperate, rattling gasp of a man being crushed to death. Captain Silas, 70 years old, his weathered face turning purple, cannot scream, cannot move, cannot even draw enough air to whisper a prayer. The massive coils of the Anaconda tighten around his chest like steel cables, each constriction forcing what little oxygen remains from his battered lungs. His ribs, already weakened by old war wounds, begin to crack with sounds like breaking twigs. 10 feet away, Blanco stands frozen. The powerful Dogo Argentino, 100 pounds of muscle and loyalty, bred for battle, trained for combat, watches his master die. The dog's white coat is splattered with mud and blood from his useless attacks on the serpent's head. The Anaconda doesn't even acknowledge him anymore. It knows what Blanco doesn't yet understand. In this moment, training means nothing. Instinct means nothing. Time has run out. This is the moment where everything ends, or where something unthinkable begins. But to understand the impossible choice this dog will make, the sacrifice no training could have prepared him for, we need to go back. Back to the morning when an old soldier and his faithful companion walked into the swamp for the last time. Before we dive into this story of survival and sacrifice, I need to ask you something. If you believe that true heroism isn't found in medals or monuments, but in the silent bonds between warriors who would die for each other, help us honor these stories. Leave a comment telling us what country you're watching from, and subscribe to Wind Echo Untold so we can continue our mission to rescue tales of honor, loyalty, and unbreakable courage that the world has forgotten. Captain Silas hadn't been called captain in 30 years. Most people in the small Florida panhandle town knew him simply as the old man who lived at the edge of the wetlands with his white dog. They'd see him at the general store once a week, buying dog food and little else. They'd nod politely. He'd nod back. Nobody asked about the scars that ran like train tracks across his forearms, or why a man his age still carried himself with military precision. Even when his body clearly protested every movement, the respiratory problems had started in the jungle decades ago. Agent Orange, the doctors said, though they could never prove it definitively enough for the VA to care. Some nights Silas would wake up gasping, feeling phantom vines around his throat, hearing the sounds of combat in every rustling leaf. But morning always came, and with it Blanco's cold nose pressed against his hand, reminding him that he was home, that he was safe, that his war was over. Blanco had been a gift, or perhaps a lifeline. 5 years ago, another veteran, a younger man who'd served in Afghanistan, had brought the puppy to Silas's door. "You need each other," was all he'd said. The young vet was right. Blanco grew into something magnificent, a creature of pure white power and unwavering devotion. Silas trained him the way he'd once trained soldiers, with patience, respect, and an understanding that loyalty cannot be commanded, only earned. Every week, they walked the same route through the wetlands. It wasn't recreation. Silas collected medicinal herbs there, plants his grandmother had taught him to identify as a child, before wars and jungles and decades of nightmares. The marsh sage helped his breathing. The watermint eased his damaged nerves. These expeditions were therapy, a connection to something pure and uncomplicated. On this particular morning, the air hung heavy with moisture. Hurricane season was approaching, and the swamp seemed to sense it, growing quiet and watchful. Silas noticed Blanco's unease, the way the dog's ears kept swiveling, alert to sounds the old man's damaged hearing couldn't catch. "Easy. Oh boy," Silas murmured, his voice rough from 40 years of cigarettes he'd finally quit. Just another walk. But it wasn't just another walk. In the deepest part of the swamp, where the water turned black as oil and the cypress roots twisted like arthritic fingers, something ancient had been waiting. The locals called it the Phantom of the Swamp, a massive anaconda that had somehow found its way to Florida decades ago, grown fat on the abundant prey, and become legend. Most dismissed it as folklore. Silas had never given it much thought. He should have. The first sign should have been the silence. Silas knelt by the water's edge, searching for a cluster of rare fever grass he'd spotted the week before. His knees protested, arthritic pain shooting up his thighs, but he'd learned to work through discomfort. That was what soldiers did. You completed the mission. Blanco circled him, whining softly. The dog never whined. Silas looked up, scanning the murky water, the hanging moss, the shadows that seemed too deep. Nothing, just paranoia, he thought. Just old combat reflexes that never fully shut off. He reached for the herb. The attack came from beneath the water's surface, so fast that Silas's combat-trained reflexes couldn't save him. One moment he was kneeling. The next, something massive and impossibly strong had erupted from the black water and wrapped itself around his torso. The anaconda, over 17 feet of pure muscle, struck not with fangs, but with the coiling precision of a living rope. Silas tried to yell, but the first constriction drove the air from his lungs. He grabbed at the serpent's body, his fingers finding no purchase on the wet, muscular scales. The anaconda, perfectly camouflaged in the dark water until the moment of attack, began the methodical process of killing its prey. It didn't need venom. It didn't need teeth. It only needed patience and pressure. The second coil wrapped around Silas's chest. He felt his ribs beginning to bend inward. The old war injuries, the shrapnel damage that had never properly healed, made him vulnerable in ways a younger man wouldn't be. His breathing, already compromised by decades of respiratory damage, became impossible. His vision started to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. Blanco exploded into action. The Dogo Argentino, bred for hunting large game, launched himself at the anaconda's head with terrifying force. His jaws, powerful enough to crush bone, clamped down on the serpent's skull. He shook viciously, the way his ancestors had been trained to fight bulls and boars. But the anaconda didn't react. It didn't loosen its grip. It barely seemed to notice. This wasn't a creature that relied on its head for attack. The head was secondary. The body was the weapon, and the body was wrapped around Silas, tightening, squeezing, killing. Blanco released and attacked again. And again. Blood began to flow from the serpent's head, but still it didn't release its prey. The dog's training, all those hours of work with Silas, had prepared him for aggressive threats, for enemies that fought back directly. But this enemy didn't fight. It simply crushed. Silas tried to signal Blanco, tried to tell his companion to run, to save himself, but no sound came out. His lips had turned blue. His eyes were starting to bulge. The crushing pressure had moved beyond pain into something else, a totality of sensation that erased everything except the knowledge that he was dying. The third coil wrapped around his throat. This was the end. Silas had survived firefights, had pulled wounded men from burning vehicles, had stared down enemy soldiers and lived to tell about it. But he would die here, in a swamp, killed by an animal that didn't hate him, didn't fear him, simply saw him as food. Blanco's attacks became frantic. The dog bit at the anaconda's body now, trying to find a weak point, trying to inflict enough damage to make the serpent release. But anacondas don't have weak points. They are muscle wrapped in muscle, designed by millions of years of evolution to do one thing perfectly: squeeze until their prey stops struggling. Silas's vision went dark. He could feel his heart struggling, could feel his damaged lungs trying desperately to expand against the impossible pressure. This was how it felt to drown in air. This was how soldiers died when no one was watching, when there were no medals or ceremonies, just a body found days later in an empty place. Blanco stopped attacking. The dog stood there panting, blood on his muzzle, staring at his master's purple face. And in that moment, something changed in the animal's eyes. Something beyond training, beyond instinct. A calculation happened, a terrible understanding that the conventional approach had failed. What happened next would be called impossible by every dog trainer who heard the story, unthinkable by every combat veteran who analyzed the tactics. But in that swamp, with death 3 seconds away, Blanco did what no training manual had ever taught, what no instinct had ever programmed into his breed. Blanco stopped looking at the anaconda's head. He stopped looking at his master's face. Instead, he focused on the point where the serpent's coils were tightest, where the pressure was crushing Silas's chest, where the scales bunched and overlapped as the massive muscles contracted. The Dogo Argentino walked calmly to that exact point. And then he bit down on his master's tormentor with a different kind of grip. Not the shaking, aggressive attack of before. This was surgical, calculated. His powerful jaws found the Anaconda's body where the coils were most compressed, where muscle met muscle in the deadly embrace. And then Blanco did the unthinkable. He didn't just bite, he tore. His jaws, bred for generation to have one of the strongest bite forces in the canine world, ripped through scale and muscle, creating a massive wound in the serpent's body. Blood poured out, hot and dark. But Blanco wasn't trying to kill the snake. He was trying to create chaos in its perfect constriction. The Anaconda, for the first time, reacted. Not to pain, but to the sudden loss of pressure, to the blood making its own body slippery against itself, to the disruption of its perfect killing machine. For just a fraction of a second, the coils loosened. It was enough. Blanco grabbed Silas's collar in his blood-soaked jaws and pulled with every ounce of strength in his 100-pound frame. Silas's body, limp and possibly lifeless, slid 6 inches towards shore. The Anaconda's coils, now compromised by its own blood, couldn't maintain the same pressure. Blanco pulled again, his paws digging trenches in the mud. Another 6 inches. The Anaconda tried to re-establish its grip, but the blood had made everything slippery, uncertain. Its perfect weapon had been turned against itself by a dog who understood that you couldn't beat the constriction through force. You had to break the physics of it, one final desperate pull. Silas's body came free of the water. The Anaconda, wounded and confused by this impossible counterattack, slithered back into the black water, leaving a trail of blood. It would survive. It would heal. But it would never again underestimate the white dog. Silas lay motionless on the bank. His chest wasn't moving. His face was the color of a bruise. Blanco nosed him frantically, whining, licking his face. Nothing. The dog pressed his full weight against Silas's chest once, twice, instinctively performing a crude form of CPR. On the third compression, Silas gasped, a horrible rattling sound that spoke of broken ribs and damaged tissue. But it was breath. It was life. His eyes opened, unfocused, seeing nothing but the white shape above him. His hand, moving with trembling weakness, found Blanco's head and held it. They stayed like that for several minutes, man and dog, both covered in blood, both having survived something that should have killed them. Slowly, with Blanco supporting his weight, Silas managed to sit up. Every breath was agony. Several ribs were definitely broken. His respiratory system, already compromised, had been pushed to catastrophic failure. But he was alive. He looked at his dog, at the blood covering that white coat, at the intelligence in those dark eyes. Blanco hadn't just saved him. The dog had done something no trainer had taught him, something that went beyond instinct. He had analyzed, adapted, and executed a strategy that defied every natural impulse. He had understood that the only way to sever the strike wasn't to attack the attacker, but to attack the attack itself. It took Silas 3 hours to make it back to his truck, leaning heavily on Blanco the entire way. The hospital stay lasted 2 weeks. 4 broken ribs, severe respiratory trauma. The doctors wanted to know what had happened. Silas told them he'd fallen. They didn't believe him, but they couldn't prove otherwise. What he didn't tell them, what he could barely admit to himself, was that he'd been saved by something he didn't fully understand. Military tacticians spend years studying strategy, learning to adapt to impossible situations, training soldiers to think beyond the obvious. But Blanco had done in seconds what most humans couldn't do with a lifetime of training. The dog had seen the true nature of the threat and found the one weakness in an otherwise perfect killing machine. In the weeks of recovery that followed, Silas thought often about that moment. About loyalty so absolute it transcended instinct. About intelligence so profound it could solve problems in seconds that might stump humans for hours. But the bond between a broken veteran and an animal that refused to let him die, the Anaconda, was never found. It had retreated deep into the swamp, back to the shadows where legends belong. But Silas knew it was still out there, a reminder that nature doesn't care about your service record or your medals. Nature only cares about one thing: survival. And on that day, survival meant a white dog making an impossible choice. A dog who understood that sometimes the only way to win is to do the unthinkable. Silas recovered, though he never returned to the deep swamp. He didn't need to. He'd found what he was looking for out there, though not in the herbs he'd been collecting. He'd found proof that the bonds forged in desperation are stronger than any formed in comfort. That true courage isn't the absence of fear, but action despite impossible odds. That sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms or carry weapons. Sometimes they just have white coats and loyal hearts. If Captain Silas and Blanco's story touched something in you, if it reminded you that courage comes in forms we don't always recognize, show your support. Leave a comment below telling us what lesson you took from this incredible tale of loyalty and sacrifice. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that the greatest strength isn't physical. It's the bond between those who refuse to give up on each other. Join us at Dogo Untold for more stories that celebrate the true meaning of honor. Stories of unbreakable bonds and impossible courage that the world needs to remember. These aren't just tales, they're legacies, and they deserve to be told. Subscribe now and help us keep these stories alive.